Russia's economic decline has begun, and Moscow is in a huge pile of trouble. This is not a revelation coming from a Western analyst or an accusation from a foreign government. It's an admission from inside Russia's own financial establishment. That's right, the Kremlin's own bank has said what the outside world has been warning about for years, that things are not looking good for them. When the institution that is supposed to calm fears is forced to admit that the economy is collapsing, it tells us that the damage has gone beyond the level of denial. The question now is not whether Russia is still under strain, but how deep the collapse goes, and what it will mean for the country, for Putin, and for the whole world. Since 2022, Russia has reshaped its economy into something that looks less like a market system and more like a wartime machine. Every lever has been pulled to keep money flowing into the military, to hide the cost of sanctions, and to convince the population that things remain under control. For a while, it worked. Officials boasted about resilience, pointing to headline GDP numbers that seemed to show growth. State television even claimed Russia was standing tall despite isolation. Just listen to the Russian ambassador speaking about the Russian economy in an interview a little while back.
I was several times in my country in the recent year. I didn't discover any kind of decline.
Despite all of this denial, behind the curtain, people saw prices rising, shelves emptying, and the ruble that brought less every month. The system had been built on illusions, and illusions can only last for so long. Now, in a rare moment of honesty, the Bank of Russia has finally admitted what the Kremlin has been trying to hide for months. The economy is collapsing. Official data shows that Russia's GDP shrank in both the first and the second quarters of 2025, meeting the standard definition of a recession. This spells big trouble for Russia's economy. And what's interesting is that this warning isn't coming from just one source. Back in June, Economy Minister Maxim Reshetnikov said Russia was on the brink of a recession. A few weeks after that, Oxford Economics backed that up, saying the country was teetering on the edge. Even inside Russia's financial system, concern is growing. Last week, Sberbank CEO Herman Gref called the economy technically stagnant, repeating earlier warnings from July and August that growth was close to zero. If these were some random Western analysts, we could take this with a grain of salt. Instead, these are unbiased voices that matter. Reshetnikov speaks for the government's own economic team, while Oxford Economics reflects how global markets see Russia, and Gref is one of the most powerful figures in Russia's private sector. When all three say the same thing, the message is clear. This isn't a short-term problem. It's a deep, long-term decline. At this point, the truth is hard to ignore. The truth is that Russia's war economy is falling apart, and even its most loyal institutions can't hide the damage anymore. To understand why this admission from the Bank of Russia is so important, we need to step back and look at how Russia built its war economy in the first place. You see, when sanctions first hit after the invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin moved fast to stop the country from panicking. Capital controls were introduced to stop money from leaving the country. Oil and gas exports were pushed even harder than ever, even if it meant selling at discounts to countries like China and India. And even at home, propaganda worked overtime to tell people the economy was strong and that the West's measures had failed. For a while, the strategy gave the appearance of stability. The ruble was defended, factories were kept running, and soldiers were paid. On the surface, Russia had dodged the worst. But much of that stability was an illusion. The growth that Russia's leaders boasted about was not the kind that benefits ordinary people. The GDP went up because the government was spending huge sums on tanks, missiles, and ammunition. That might make the economy look great on paper, but it does not put food on the table or keep medicine affordable. At the same time that growth was being preached, prices for daily goods crept up, savings lost value, and the ruble quietly weakened. People began to feel the pressure in their own pockets, even as officials claimed that Russia had become stronger under sanctions. However, now even the Bank of Russia has been forced to signal that the story can no longer be maintained. A statement from such an institution is not made lightly. Its job is to normally keep people calm, to project confidence, to prevent panic. For it to suggest that cracks are showing means that the problems have grown too large to hide. It's a sign that the Russian leadership knows that collapse is underway. So the big question is, why is this collapse happening? Well, to be frank, there is no single cause, but rather a combination of factors that have collectively pushed the economy to the breaking point. To start with, sanctions have been biting harder than the Kremlin expected. Entire industries have lost access to Western markets, technology, and finance. Europe, once Russia's biggest customer for oil and gas, turned away. In response, Moscow has relied on a shadow fleet of aging tankers to move oil to its new buyers, often at steep discounts. That keeps the revenue flowing, but at a fraction of what it once was. This year, Russia's oil and gas revenues dropped by over 20% compared to last year, totaling just under 6.03 trillion rubles in the first 8 months. August alone saw a 35% year-on-year decline, with monthly revenues falling to around 505 billion rubles. That's a massive hit to the budget. Energy money that once paid for everything from pensions to schools is now being burned just to keep the war going. And with the government forced to revise its annual forecast downward by nearly a quarter, the bottom line is sinking fast. We all know an economy needs money, and with very little of that present, things are going haywire. But sanctions alone don't explain the collapse. Russia's own decisions have made things far worse. Military spending has spiraled beyond control. Right now, defense consumes more than a third of the entire state budget. That shift didn't happen quietly. Social services, healthcare, and regional development have all been scaled back so that tanks can keep rolling off the lines. The logic is simple: guns over butter. It might sustain the war effort for now, but it's draining the rest of the economy. It's a mistake other empires have made before, and we'll dive into that later in the video. Meanwhile, the ruble has wobbled from crisis to crisis. In 2023 and 2024, the currency saw multiple episodes of near free fall. Each time, the central bank stepped in with sharp interest rate hikes to stop the bleeding. But those hikes came at a cost. Small businesses struggled to borrow, mortgage payments soared, and families had to cut back. And with imports restricted, the price of basic goods climbed even higher. Every time the ruble lost value, life got harder for ordinary Russians. Defending the currency bought time, but it also strangled growth. The economy wasn't breathing, it was bracing. Another major blow to the economy has come from the loss of people. Since the war began, and especially after mobilization was announced, over 1 million Russians have permanently left the country. Many were young, educated, and highly skilled. Tech workers, engineers, doctors, and entrepreneurs packed up and walked away, leaving behind gaps that aren't easy to fill. These weren't just numbers on a chart, they were the backbone of innovation, the drivers of growth, the people who kept industries moving forward. Their departure has hollowed out key sectors. What's left is a labor market stretched thin. Factories are short on staff, farms are struggling to harvest, and hospitals are understaffed. Productivity is falling across the board. A war economy might keep running on sheer force, but without people to repair, build, and invent, it eventually grinds down. And Russia is now feeling that grind. And as if all of this isn't enough, corruption has made things even worse. With billions pouring into defense contracts, insiders have treated the war as a business opportunity. What this means is that money meant for weapons disappears. Supplies meant for soldiers are resold or never delivered. And projects run over budget, fall behind schedule, or just fail. The Russian system doesn't reward competence, it rewards connections. Those closest to power thrive, while the country pays the price. This isn't new for Russia, but under the pressure of war, it has become more destructive. The scale is bigger, and the stakes are definitely higher. It's a familiar pattern, one that echoes the late Soviet Union when corruption and waste helped drag the system into stagnation. Back then, the rot was slow. Now, it's accelerating. On top of everything else, Russia has found itself increasingly isolated. The Kremlin points to its ties with BRICS and other so-called friendly nations, but those relationships are far weaker than the ones it lost with the West. Moscow is no longer treated as a strategic partner by the likes of China and India. It is seen as a supplier with limited leverage. The more Russia leans on these deals, which are ever-changing, the more dependent it becomes. What was once a diversified economy, integrated with Europe, has now shrunk into a bargain bin exporter, reliant on a handful of buyers who hold the stronger hand. That shift has stripped Russia of pricing power, long-term contracts, and the kind of influence it once wielded in global markets. All of these pressures have collided to form a perfect storm, and the damage is no longer hidden. Inflation continues to eat away at household incomes. Russians are paying more for food, medicine, and housing than ever before. The cost of living keeps climbing, while wages lag behind. Factories are struggling to source parts and materials. Imports from the West have dried up, and replacements from Asia are inconsistent and often inferior. Civilian industries are being squeezed because the military gets first pick. Local governments, especially in poorer regions, are watching their budgets collapse. Basic services are being cut. Schools, clinics, and transportation systems are falling behind. while Moscow diverts resources to sustain the war. And people feel it every day, in their wallets, in their neighborhoods, and in their routines. And that kind of reality cannot be hidden forever. You would think that these are enough problems for Russia to deal with, but no. Even Mother Nature is dealing heavy blows to Russian fields. Bad weather across key farming zones has cut deeply into harvests. Drought in southern regions have shriveled crops. Floods in Siberia have drowned fields. And unexpected frosts in the Volga region have damaged young shoots. Wheat, barley, and sunflowers all saw lower yields this season. As a result, export volumes dropped while costs soared. This has created a situation where farmers must pay more for equipment and fuel because of sanctions and global price shocks. Meanwhile, government support has thinned, as defense spending claims more of the budget. For many people, that means bread costs more, vegetables are harder to find, and food security, once a strength for Russia, is now a weak link. The agriculture sector, which could once buffer economic shocks, is itself being buffeted and failing. When what puts food on the table starts to fall apart, everything else gets harder. And along with all of these problems, add to that list Russia's collapsing healthcare system. Hospitals in many regions struggle with shortages of medicine and medical equipment. Labs for diagnostics work with outdated tech, while surgeries are delayed because supplies are missing. In rural areas, clinics have closed or operate with only minimal staff. Doctors are overworked, often without pay, keeping pace with inflation. Patients with chronic illnesses find it harder to get treatment. And when it comes to infant and maternal care, they suffer significantly more. All in all, the health situation is quite messy. When the Kremlin funnels money towards war, ordinary illnesses have become dangerous, and this has led to the direct suffering of many Russians. This is why the announcement from the Bank of Russia carries so much weight. It is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about admitting that the collapse is no longer a distant threat. It has already begun. For years, the Kremlin leaned on denial, distraction, and a steady stream of propaganda to keep the public calm and the narrative intact. But now, even its own financial establishment can no longer maintain the pretense. The message is unmistakable. The war economy is buckling under its own pressure, and the fallout will reach far beyond the finance ministry. The real question is, what comes next? For Russia itself, the collapse signals a shift in public mood. Unrest is rising. Dissatisfaction is spreading. Putin's long-standing image as the guarantor of stability has taken a serious hit. That image was never built on prosperity. It was built on predictability. If people stop believing that the state can keep their lives steady, the foundation of its power begins to crack. This loss of faith is already being seen through the growth and expansion of the black markets. People are turning to informal systems just to get by. That shift weakens the state's grip and opens the door to new risks. When trust fades and control slips, even small disruptions can spiral into something much larger. That erosion of trust leads directly to the next fault line, the war effort itself. The strain on Russia's military is just as severe as the pressure on its economy. Keeping an army supplied with weapons, vehicles, and ammunition is expensive, even in times of growth. Doing so while the economy contracts makes it nearly impossible to sustain. Factories that once produced civilian goods have been repurposed to build weapons. But even those factories are running into shortages. Russia no longer has easy access to the advanced technology it once imported from Europe and the United States. Chips, sensors, and precision machinery that modern warfare depends on are now out of reach. Substitutes exist, but they are slower, more costly, and often less reliable. The result is a military machine running on declining efficiency, even as battlefield demands continue to rise. Soldiers are feeling that strain firsthand. Wages that once seemed generous are now eroded by inflation. And still, payments of those meager wages are delayed. And when it comes to resources that would allow Russia to win, it's worse. Equipment is often outdated or poorly maintained. Supplies are thin. And for those deployed to the front, the war feels endless, while conditions at home worsen for their families. That disconnect eats away at morale. And morale is not just a soft metric, it is one of the most vital resources any army has. A government can print more money or draft more men, but it cannot manufacture belief in victory once that belief has been drained away. And these problems don't just affect the soldiers or the poor. Even then, the Russian elite is facing its own kind of pressure. For them, the pressure is no longer just financial, it is psychological. With all that chaos that's been happening, YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you've ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or a faceless channel, now's kind of the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to get started and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. And that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one YouTube video for completely free. So, if you are someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can watch that video here on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description or the card on your screen. Oligarchs who built their fortunes through global markets have been cut off. Their yachts, their villas, their offshore accounts are either frozen or unreachable. At home, they are being squeezed to fund the war effort, even as their own businesses shrink. Some have responded by clinging tighter to Putin, hoping proximity to power will protect them. Others are quietly moving assets abroad, using shell companies, crypto transfers, and foreign intermediaries to shield their wealth from seizures or collapse. But not everyone escapes Putin's wrath. And amidst a collapsing economy, some are used as examples to warn the rest. In recent months, a string of deaths has shaken the elite. To start with, Roman Starovoyt, the former transport minister, was found dead in his car just hours after being dismissed from office. Official reports called it a suicide, but the timing and the circumstances, that raises some questions. He had been under investigation for embezzling over 1 billion rubles meant for defense fortifications. His former deputy, who briefly served as governor of Kursk, was arrested earlier this year and reportedly testified against him. The message was clear. Loyalty is no longer a guarantee of safety. And then we have Andrei Badalov, the vice president of Transneft, who fell from a balcony in July. He was a top oil executive with deep ties to the state. His death followed a pattern seen too often in recent years. One of the high-ranking officials, tycoons, and insiders who have died in strange falls, sudden suicides, or unexplained accidents. Some were under investigation, others were simply out of favor. Now, the Kremlin denies foul play, but the fear is real. Former officials describe a climate of paranoia, where everyone is watching everyone else, and no one knows who will be next. Faith is fading, and when that happens at the top, things crumble down fast. So, with the whole domestic situation now firmly explained, have you ever wondered how this situation affects the world as a whole? After all, the effects of this collapse are not confined to Russia. To begin with, the world has already felt the shockwave in energy and food markets. When Russia restricts exports of gas, oil, or grain, global prices spike. That hits countries far from the battlefield, raising heating costs in Europe and food prices in Africa and Asia. Markets remain on edge because the Kremlin has shown it is willing to weaponize resources. The weaker Russia's economy becomes, the more unpredictable those moves may be. Oil and gas revenues once gave Moscow leverage and stability. Now, with income falling, energy is more likely to be used in sudden bursts of pressure that destabilize global trade. Wheat and fertilizer offer another example. Russia and Ukraine were once central to the world's food supply. War and sanctions have disrupted that flow, leaving importing countries anxious about shortages. If Russia's economy continues to weaken and agricultural output suffers, that anxiety could turn into real scarcity. Every shock in global commodities adds to inflation in countries already under strain, from Europe to South America to Africa. So while the collapse begins inside Russia, its effects ripple outward, touching lives far beyond its borders. The deeper truth is that this collapse marks the unravel of the system Putin spent 2 decades building. His rule was never about delivering prosperity or freedom. It was about offering order, the promise that life would remain steady, even if limited. That bargain is now broken. The war destroyed the conditions that held it together, as the Kremlin chose confrontation and militarization. In doing so, it mortgaged the stability of the entire country. There are echoes here that history cannot ignore. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union found itself in a similar trap. Decades of military spending had drained the economy. Social services suffered, consumer goods were poor, and corruption was rampant. By the time reform was attempted, the system was too brittle to respond. The result was that the shortages multiplied, civil unrest spread, and collapse followed. Today, the pattern is repeating. Once again, war spending has hollowed out the economy. Once again, corruption and mismanagement are eating away at efficiency. Once again, the public is left with empty promises while leaders chase power abroad. Some argue that Russia is more resilient than the Soviet Union was, that it has adapted to sanctions and built new ties with Asia, and there is some truth in that, but strength is relative. An economy reduced to selling discounted oil to a handful of buyers is not resilient, it's dependent, and dependence breeds weakness. The very partners Russia leans on, like China, benefit from that weakness. They buy cheap energy, gain leverage, and treat Russia as a junior partner rather than an equal. That's not stability. It's a slow decline beneath the surface. What happens next is not only about budgets and shortages, it's about how the people begin to think when the ground beneath them feels less steady every year. Russians have grown used to hardship, but even resilience has limits. At first, people adjust. They cut back. They rely on family. They look for ways around shortages. But after years of decline, frustration seeps into private life. It becomes the subject of hushed conversations on trains, of grumbles in workplace corridors, or worries passed between parents who see fewer prospects for their children. This kind of discontent rarely shows up in protests or headlines. It builds slowly, invisibly, until one day it suddenly becomes undeniable. The sense of quiet pressure is not new. History offers a haunting reminder. The Soviet Union looked immovable until the moment it wasn't. The difference today is that Russia is not collapsing in peace. It is collapsing while fighting a war that devours the very resources the state needs to survive. That combination is far more volatile. Weakness at home and conflict abroad pulls against each other, and together they magnify instability. And instability leads to an even more dangerous question. What comes after? Systems built around one man rarely leave room for transition. Putin has ruled as though tomorrow would never come, but tomorrow always comes. Without a clear successor, without institutions strong enough to carry the weight, every shift becomes a gamble. The elites know this. They maneuver in silence, watching one another, unsure of who will move first. Ordinary people sense it too. The unease that comes from knowing the future is unspoken yet looming. The absence of a plan does not mean stability. It means that when change comes, it will come chaotically. This is why the Bank of Russia's announcement mattered so deeply. It was not just a chart about inflation or growth, it was an admission that the story no longer matches reality. For ordinary Russians, it confirms the struggle they feel every day in their wallets and in their homes. For the elite, it sends a chilling signal that the system they rely on to protect them is faltering. And for the world, it's a reminder that Russia's unraveling will not stay inside of its own borders. Economic collapse, political turmoil, and military strain in a nuclear power always ripple outward, which is why the stakes today are so high. Russia has entered a period of deep uncertainty. The war economy is breaking. At this point, the message is unavoidable. Russia is no longer standing on the edge of crisis, it's already in the middle of one. The numbers are collapsing, the banks are sounding alarms, and even officials who usually paper over the truths are admitting that the economy is straining to the breaking point. For ordinary Russians, this isn't an abstract debate. It means higher prices, fewer jobs, and the constant fear of what comes next. For the Kremlin, it means an economy that can no longer be controlled with slogans and emergency measures. So where does all this lead? The options are few, and none of them are clean. The best the Kremlin can hope for is to patch the cracks just enough to delay a full collapse. Maybe by borrowing more, maybe by leaning harder on China. But buying time isn't solving the problem. It just drags it out. More likely, Russia slips into a long, grinding stagnation. No collapse, no recovery, just a slow bleed. Wages stay flat, prices keep rising. People adapt, then snap. In the worst-case scenario, the economy breaks completely. The ruble crashes, banks lock their doors, and the chaos begins. Protests spill into the streets, and the Kremlin lashes out, both at home and abroad. No matter which path it takes, the collapse isn't coming, it's here. It's in the numbers. It's in the headlines they can't bury. It's in the quiet panic among elites who suddenly realize that the system on which they've built their fortunes is slipping out of their control. This isn't just about recession. It's about a state running out of tools, out of money, out of talent, and out of time. The war machine that once held the country together is now tearing it apart from the inside. And even the institutions designed to protect the illusion, like the central bank, are starting to tell the truth. For Russia, the economy is no longer something to manage. It's something to survive. And for the world, that means the fallout is just beginning.